So good morning. I wanted to thank Dr. Rubio and the ISUP committee and our Greek colleagues for the opportunity to speak. And really, we had a great overview of climate change by Professor Weidman. And this is really very complimentary with a deep dive in the concept of structural violence and how that changes life for children. I'm going to start with just a picture of climate change in our country, the United States. This is Hurricane Milton that just ravished Florida and is a stark reminder of structural violence and what it does for actual children. So the concept of structural violence is a social structure or a social institution that creates avoidable impairment of fundamental human needs. It creates inequity. And that is really where the idea of climate and violence against children come from, because we know that climate change is produced by higher income countries with the effects disproportional in people living in lower income countries. There is special vulnerability for children, and that we have acknowledgement and repair as part of what we need to do to help to take care of this. Structural violence as an institution has multiple and intersecting forces that create inequity. So poverty, racism, gender inequity, migration, classism, all parts of structural violence, all impacted by climate change. What's the relationship to our sustainable development goals? The problem primarily falls under goals 3 and 13, which is really looking at health and well-being for all and action to combat climate change. This is part of our sustainable development goals. We should also consider the other sustainable development goals that impact women's health, children's health, those who are vulnerable, and quality education, and then clean water and sanitation. And I actually thought that Professor Weidman's description of this and the different forces was better than this particular slide. But this talks about what happens in the environment because of rising global temperatures and relates to the forces of drought and floods, ecosystem disruption, and increased temperatures, and what this does for children. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about children because we know that children are more vulnerable. Why is this? They have increased minute ventilation. They breathe faster than adults. They take more food and water per weight than adults do. So the food and water quality is so important. That there is physiologic and cognitive immaturity. One of the things I point out in hot climates is that adults drink more water. Adults take it easy when it's hot outside. Children don't. Children go and play and they're active, and drinking water is not part of what they normally do. So they are much more affected by heat from climate change. And that there's a greater interaction with outdoors for children. It is estimated, this is important, it is estimated that 88% of the global burden of disease due to climate change occurs in children under 5 years of age, and that children in low resource countries are at the highest risk. But even in the United States, where I'm from, we see increased severe heat events, changes in our pollen activity, altered infectious disease patterns, and worsening severe weather events. And that we know that vulnerable people are most affected by climate injustice. So infant and children are much more prone to getting diseases, as well as malnutrition during floods. Breastfeeding is less effective due to lack of privacy and other nutrients for mothers. And that milk production actually decreases during severe heat. So heat-related illness in children, to talk about this as structural violence. Children have immature thermoregulation, a higher metabolic rate, and dependence on caregivers. So they are at much higher risk for dehydration, particularly infants. And if you look at who suffers from mortality due to heat, we all think about the elderly, but it's actually infants who are the second highest heat mortality rate in all groups. Allergy in children. We have seen allergic conditions markedly increase on our wards, in our clinic, in our hospitals in the United States. And this is because there's elevated carbon dioxide and pollen counts. So when there's elevated carbon dioxide in the air, Ragweed plants produce more pollen. Plants grow about twice as fast as they did 50 years ago, and that the average US pollen count increased by almost 50% in the 2000s relative to the 1990s. If you look at longer ragweed pollen seasons, look up top there at Canada. Canada has had an increase in almost a month in their pollen activity. So we see more allergies, we see more asthma-related conditions in children due to climate change. We look at mosquito-borne disease. Now, this is in the United States, where this child presented in 2022 with a rash, was diagnosed first with urticaria, but then came back with swollen, painful knees and was eventually diagnosed with Lyme disease. Lyme disease in the United States used to be most common in little boys who were playing in the woods and were in contact with the Ixodes scapularis tick that carried the Borrelia for Lyme disease. But this is a graph showing what Lyme disease is doing in the United States now. So Lyme disease was named after a town in Connecticut on the East Coast called Lyme. And if you see the red spots in through here, this is where Lyme disease was traditionally. But look at where the yellow is and where the orange is along the East Coast, in the southern states, and also now to the Midwest. The two yellow states are Minnesota and Wisconsin. Never used to see Lyme disease. Now we see it there. And that is because of rising temperatures and different rising conditions that make it a great place for Lyme disease to thrive and the ticks to grow. We know that heat throughout the world increases mosquito-borne diseases. So the primary vectors for dengue and chikungunya and Zika are the Aedes mosquitoes, and that climate change can expand that vector range, extend the transmission season, shorten the mosquito life cycle so that there is more time for mosquitoes to actually infect children, and that there's reduced time to mosquito infectivity. So if we look at the impact of climate change on infectious disease, I'll let you take a look at the pink area there. With rising temperatures, what we see is antimicrobial resistance. We see coccidiomycosis. We see more malaria and emerging fungal infections. And we see more mosquito-borne viruses due to vectors. Another place where we have seen increase in vector-borne disease is Nepal. So dengue is a rapidly emerging disease. We see this in Los Angeles as well, too. My residents are finding this on the floor in the hospitals and in the clinics. But in Nepal, in the very high elevations, you never used to see mosquito-borne disease. It's very common now. And that at-risk population is primarily children, but it's expected to increase as these diseases push further into Nepal's highlands. If you look at the damaged zone, this chart actually shows what happened in 2021 with the increase in dengue cases in the highlands of Nepal. Again, this is because of increased temperature and increased environment for these mosquitoes to thrive. Pakistan experienced floods in the last several years, with a big one being in 2019, and that around 2 million people are expected to become climate migrants. So the idea that increasing temperatures leading to droughts and floods, leading to poverty, and then leading to migration is really something that's very important. In the United States, we're having conversations about migrants coming to our US southern border. And the whole conversation is about how do we keep people out? It's not about what the root cause is for migration, but it is climate violence. It is structural violence due to climate change. And the damage has been done in Pakistan. So poverty leading to conflict and damage to crops and infrastructure are all part of that climate violence. And the medical concerns primarily affect children. So skin diseases, waterborne infections, cases of respiratory illnesses, and even snake bites and dog bites due to poverty and increased heat and the floods. We have seen immunization programs such as polio programs hampered by rain and flooding. Now, Dr. Goldhagen will probably talk about this with violence and conflict, but we see it with climate as well. This is an example of what we see day to day in Los Angeles, and that are migrants coming from what's called the Northern Triangle of Central America. So they're the countries of Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. And what we have seen is historical agricultural overuse, deforestation, and now floods and drought. This is a video that I'm not sure will play, but we will see. Now, it didn't really do this. It was a nice video that talked about a family in Guatemala, what used to be the breadbasket of Central America, how they used to grow all the crops and be able to sell their crops to other families. And because of the droughts and floods, they are now climate migrants. So there are internal displaced, climate-induced displacement. Families in the rural area can no longer sustain themselves by growing crops, and so they're moving to the cities. The cities are become overcrowded. There's increased violence, and that induces climate migration. So many families cannot live where they're living because of violence, because of poverty. And so they are traveling north up to the United States to find a job, to find a different area of living. One of the fallacies that we see in the United States is that people think that these are people who are just poor coming up there. The truth is the very poor cannot migrate. They can't afford to do that. So these are middle and upper class individuals who've been affected by climate, who are hiring what are called the coyotes and spending thousands of dollars to be traveling up through to the United States. And so the people that come to our community who are climate migrants are teachers, they're accountants, they're business people, they're chefs, and really a great deal of opportunity for those of us in the United States. But sadly, people who don't want to leave their homes and have to leave because now the greatest number of people who are migrating are climate migrants. So fundamental changes are needed. And when we work with youth and talk with our youth who have migrated or are from some of these countries, what we hear is that there is investment in these countries to promote sustainable agriculture and water conservation. What's really important to know is that some of the indigenous methods of containing water and farming become what we need to be able to follow in order to be able to heal our climate. So the Sahel tribe is employing traditional water conservation techniques. Zai pits and half moons in the ocean help to create some of the fishing and the water life there. Our Guatemalan indigenous people are using traditional planting to increase crop yields. And they're beginning to teach us in Los Angeles how to do this. And we're learning to do this and implementing this in community gardens. The Swinomish tribe, Native American tribe, are using clam gardens to improve fishing conditions. In Guyana, they're working on biodiversity efforts. And then in South America and Brazil, there's tree planting efforts in the Amazon. So fundamental changes to invest in some of these older methods of healing the climate and healing the planet are necessary, and enforcing protections that are outlined by the UN Health Commission on Human Rights for climate refugees and migrants is needed. And then what's needed also is policy to mitigate the effects of climate injustice for our children. So we talk about no human being is illegal. And that means opening safe routes to sanctuary for people who cannot stay where they are, resettlement, a new visa category for those fleeing violence, persecution, and climate damage, and the ability to take the wealth of the knowledge of these individuals and start to work together to improve climate where they are going to, so that we can start to improve climate where they are from. We need government leadership to combat racism and xenophobia, which is very much, again, a conversation in the United States. And the understanding that asylum is a human right and that the world has a very short memory. because after World War II, most countries agreed to protect refugees through the 1951 Refugee Convention and through the UN agencies like UNHCR. So the questions we have to ask ourselves for structural violence is, what are the implications of migration driven by climate change? What steps can we take as a society to prevent unnecessary harm and suffering for children? What are the learning needs for our healthcare professionals treating children? And then what leadership issues do we need to focus on to ensure that sustainable global public health policy and respect the healthcare needs of children? Because again, children under 5, 88% of the victims of climate change. This is structural violence. And this is a category that we need to respect and understand and know that the repair is something that's within our grasp. We just need to implement it and provide the political will to do this. Thank you.